doctor in the world right now, Dr. Peter McCullough, joined us. And I think I know his time is limited. And I also like to usually go to somebody who hasn't been on the show before. So who better than to go to Dr. Peter McCullough? I'm sure you're already getting tons of feedback about your appearance on JRE, Joe Rogan podcast. So why not go to you and maybe get some of your predictions on how you think all the work you're doing and all the energy and efforts that you put in to fighting back against what's going on, if you're optimistic, or do you think we have a long battle ahead of us?
Well, Ricky, thanks for having me back on the show. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I'm an academic physician in Dallas, Texas, and I have just a few minutes today, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to get off the call. It looks like a terrific show that you have tonight, but last week I went to the man cave of podcaster Joe Rogan, and I have to tell you, when I finished, he looked like a prize fighter. Now, he looked like he had 15 rounds with somebody he didn't expect. Joe Rogan was pretty shell-shocked with what he heard about COVID-19. I think he's spent too much time in his cave. Really, Joe was just blown away. He had no idea of what we were seeing with respect to, the failure of the vaccines, of problems with vaccine safety, loss of efficacy. We went through, COVID-19 from soup to nuts. And I think he learned a lot. And he immediately invited me back on to learn more. And what's happened is, the whole media outside of, programs like yours and others, the Trusted News Initiative has basically blocked the truth on COVID-19, from the beginning of the pandemic. And because the major media aligned with the social media, they agreed to block any information on early treatment, block anything on vaccine safety, and only promote the vaccines as the only choice. And everybody knows something is wrong because we still haven't gotten a public safety report on the vaccines. We haven't even been told which vaccine is the best vaccine, that which vaccine works better than others. I mean, people know something is really off when they know they're not getting basic information. So they're seeking it through basically podcasting and media like this. So I want to boil it down to 5 points that I've recently presented at Reawaken America, as well as other programs. And there are these 5 points. This is what I've learned as a doctor. I have over 650 publications in the peer-reviewed literature, now 52 on COVID-19. I'm a very frequent commentator for Fox News, Newsmax, Real America. I've testified in the U.S. Senate, multiple state senates. This is what I've learned. I give you 5 points that you can take forward on COVID-19. The first point is the infection is only spread when people have symptoms, period. So there's no asymptomatic spread. We have enough data and studies that have basically proven that. That means we never need to lock down schools. We don't need to lock down anybody. And it's only those who are sick that need to stay at home during the treatment period at home. This is so fundamental. Our schools are open in the United States. There's no school outbreaks. Our football stadiums are open, wide open. They could have been open last year. We have more COVID now than we had last year. And in fact, our football stadiums are wide open and we're not seeing major outbreaks, okay? Because people know if they're sick, don't go out and go to congregate settings. The second point is no asymptomatic testing, none. That means no testing on the border of Canada to the United States, no testing before you get on airplanes, no testing in the workplace, no routine testing for athletes. Why? Because it's not spread asymptomatically. So we don't need to test people without symptoms. The tests are only approved by regulatory agencies for symptoms. Even the World Health Organization and CDC, they don't support asymptomatic testing. So we need to drop all that testing. People need to walk past the testing tables and say, listen, they're not approved by anybody and they're not recommended by anybody. They're an overreach. Let's drop them. Point number 3, once we get through the illness, the immunity is robust, complete, and durable. You can't get COVID-19 a second time. You can test positive 1,000,000 times because the tests can be falsely positive long after the illness. But once one's through the true illness, they can't get it a second time. If it was possible, we would have seen hundreds of millions of cases in the elderly. And in fact, we're not seeing that at all. It's one and done. And now even the US CDC admits it. They've never had a bona fide second case of COVID-19 in the same person. So we need to give up this idea that once you've had it, that means no masks. That means no worries. You can take care of your family members who have COVID-19, never need a vaccine, never need to go through treatment or anything else. You're done. Basically, it's one and done. Point number 4, the infection is imminently treatable. We have treatments. Now, even our National Institutes of Health says that patients get early treatment with monoclonal antibodies. We've seen former President Trump. We've seen Governor Abbott in Texas, who, where the vaccines failed, he got monoclonal antibodies. Podcaster Joe Rogan, I went through it. Joe Rogan got the McCullough protocol just as I drew it up for the nation and the world. Joe Rogan got basically the finest approach. He was over it in 3 days. Quarterback Aaron Rodgers, who's been with everybody in that club. How many more examples do we need to see of people having a response with monoclonal antibodies? So we lead off with monoclonal antibodies. We have a whole array of nutraceuticals and supplements and over-the-counter drugs that everybody can have in basically a COVID-19 emergency kit at home. And then we use selected prescription drugs at home to get people through the illness. The only people being hospitalized are those who get no treatment at home. And it's a real travesty. We're 2 years into it, and people are still waiting at home to be hospitalized. That should never happen. And then the point number 5, the vaccines that we have now, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, and AstraZeneca, are not sufficiently safe, nor are they sufficiently effective to feature in a pandemic response program. You're probably aware in the United States that the Biden mandates with CMS have been struck down all over the country. Our Texas governor and others came in with executive orders banning vaccine mandates. They're gone. The Texas Work Commission has a letter now. Everybody, if they're going to require vaccination in the workplace, they must admit patients to have exemptions from it. So this is good news. I personally think the vaccines should be paused. They should be paused and have a thorough safety review. We still haven't had a safety report. And the numbers of deaths, we're up to 19,000 deaths after vaccination in our CDC VAERS system. Half are domestic, half are ex-US. We have over 250,000 emergency visits for this, for injuries, and we have about 31,000 who are permanently disabled now from the vaccines. That toll is too high, and that's the reason why people are protesting all over the world. If the vaccines were safe and they worked, there wouldn't be any protests. People just take the vaccine and move on, and that's the reason why there's so much problems in the world, because the vaccines aren't sufficiently safe or effective. So those major points are what I've boiled down for COVID-19. What I see for the future is I think we're going to have a few more waves. The Omicron variant looks less transmissible and a milder form because it's so mutated now that while we're seeing cases, our CDC tells us that it's almost exclusively mild, and 79% of those with Omicron are fully vaccinated. So yet another piece of evidence the vaccines are just not going to cover it. There's really no reason to feature them. So that's my update.
So are you, obviously you going on a Joe Rogan podcast is huge for people just opening their eyes to how long they've been misled. Do you think that we're trending in the right direction?
Well, we're breaking. No, Joe, he has, I think 69 million subscribers on a podcast. That's pretty strong. I know I've been on Daystar. I've been on twice. Each view has had 600 million. And then they run reruns. So it's about 1.7 billion have seen Daystar. So Daystar is kind of the biggest. Sadly, Marcus Lamb, who led Daystar, has actually died of COVID-19 to really, in a sense, put a cornerstone on how important this public health problem is. But yeah, I think that the audiences are opening their eyes. People know that, they know these 5 points, and they know, because they're jamming packed in football stadiums. They know everything's okay. They're getting early treatment, and they're absolutely pushing back on the vaccines, and they're showing a lot of backbone in the United States. They're not taking the vaccines. We have about 200 million Americans out of 330 million that actually did take one of the doses of the vaccines, but the centers are empty for boosters. Nobody wants boosters, and they've just had enough, basically. They know they're not sufficiently safe, and they don't work well enough to have people's employment tied to it or have other social freedoms withdrawn.
Yeah, Joel, I know you've been also as deep into this as any of us. Do you have any questions for Dr. McCullough before he leaves? Or
No, I listen. I agree with everything Peter says, and I would just bring up the number that people ought to be looking at. Of course, is the official We're approaching 800,000 COVID-related deaths according to CDC. That's an astronomical number. I keep pointing out to people, when you looked at 9/11 or Pearl Harbor attacks, we were talking about 3,000 dead in each of those events. Now we're talking about so many thousands of deaths due to COVID and the improper management of the pandemic. So this is a disaster made by government. I want to emphasize it is the government that has screwed up everything. They have not listened to the medical experts like Peter. And there's a lot of positive news. I keep writing articles these days trying to communicate a positive story. For example, vitamin D. We have enormous amounts of research showing the latest German research I was so impressed with that actually determine what blood level of vitamin D you need to be really protected against COVID. So we know what that number is, yet if you go to an ordinary doctor, it's hard to get your blood tested for vitamin D, and CDC, FDA, all of the agencies, they should have been promoting vitamin D and blood testing for vitamin D for the last 2 years. They haven't done that. So there's a lot of serious problems. Home testing kits. I agree about, the normal testing is awful. Tons of false positives with PCR. CDC should have mandated no more than 25 cycles. If they would have done that long ago, we would have reduced the false positives from the PCR testing. But I think rapid antigen testing at home is an important option for people to have so that they can have security at home. If they get a positive antigen test, then they ought to go see their doctor, get some medical advice and help. But I think in Europe, the UK, they give out many free kits, or some countries very low-cost home testing kits. This is just another example of what our government has not done that they should have done and could have done, and it would have been greatly helpful to people.
That's well said. And, I use that vitamin D meta-analysis every day in my practice. If we have over 50 units on the vitamin D blood test, there's almost zero risk of COVID-19 and zero mortality. I do the same thing when I go on Fox News. I really try to get in my mind a positive message for America. One of the most positive signs now is what people can do at home with no doctor. So we now have 9 clinical studies, 9, including a very large, convincing randomized trial of using oral and nasal virucidal therapy, washes, to basically kill the virus in the nose and mouth as it's replicating, particularly the Delta variant. And it was led out of Bangladesh. But in a randomized trial by Chowdhury and colleagues, 606 individuals randomized to 303 in each group, using dilute povidone iodine or betadine, diluted with water, that actually squirting it up the nose and sniffing it back, spitting it out and gargling, that markedly dropped the viral load in the nose and mouth in patients early in COVID-19 and had a dramatic impact in preventing hospitalization and death. In fact, it actually, if you do that on a daily basis after returning home from going outside, that has a bigger impact than vaccination in preventing COVID-19. Bangladesh uses this widely. Go check them out on Worldometer. They got 160 million people living in crowded conditions. They have virtually zero COVID. It's astonishing what they've accomplished. One of the things we have not seen in pandemic response has been international collaboration. Our groups in the United States have not held any international conferences. Mm-hmm. We haven't had any Bethesda meetings to call academics into Washington for us to review our data on advances. I agree with Dr. Hirschhorn. It is really our pandemic response, at this head in Washington, the NIH, CDC, NIH, and White House task force has been abysmal. And Scott Atlas's most recent book really highlights this. I had dinner with Scott a few weeks ago. We went over everything. He said he was the only one showing up to meetings, analyzing the data like I do and like Dr. Hirschhorn and other media consultants, that he analyzed data every day. But the other individuals you're familiar with seeing on TV had analyzed nothing. They only had pre-decided their talking points. And so with no international collaboration, no teams of doctors working the major pillars of pandemic response, we have fallen into what he thinks is a crisis of incompetence.
Yes, absolutely.
I've heard you talk about that, but it also seems like you're also entertaining the idea that there's much more going on, obviously, because I think for a while it's like, okay, maybe they just didn't know about this. Maybe they just didn't know about that. Maybe it was misunderstanding. But it's like now there's so many dots, you can't help but connect them and realize there's something more going on. And I think that's why what you're doing is so important, because to be brave enough to go on the front lines, knowing that anybody who speaks out against it, and other people have seen this. I mean, people like Jimmy Dore, Joe Rogan, anybody who speaks out and says anything somewhat negative about the vaccine immediately get pigeonholed as an anti-vaxxer, regardless of the information or whatever that they're presenting. For you to go out on a limb and to do this is just incredible. And there's no better person than you to do it, because you're so well spoken. Everything that you state is backed by facts. And but I do think there's a real battle going on. And I mean, do you think that this is something that we can win? I mean, because it just seems like even with information being exposed and the truth seeping out into the public, it still seems like they're still attempting to just push the same narrative.
I had a conversation with David Martin, who many of you know has been on the trail of the information technology and the intellectual property of the vaccines and SARS-CoV-2, et cetera, the patents. And I had a conversation with him actually at the Reawaken America in Dallas this last weekend. He thinks we're winning. He sees cracks happening all over. Robert F. Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, has really revealed a lot. And it is a complete work of nonfiction, just like Peter Bregin's book, COVID-19 and the Global Predators, We Are the Prey. Joel Hirschhorn had one of the very early books out on this. It's these incredible works of nonfiction that are incredibly factual and cited. There's every single thing is cited. It's not opinion in these books. It is exposing a vast, vast web of connections. Maybe Dr. Hirschhorn can say more.
Well, I think one of the things I've been looking at lately is so many of the people dying today from COVID in hospitals, and most of the deaths are occurring in hospitals, and the hospital protocols are not working. They're still giving remdesivir, which we know is a terrible, ineffective, and unsafe drug. So there have been over 100 court cases now in the U.S. where families have gone to get, and there's a lawyer, and only about less than 10 of these have been successful. The hospitals, even when they get court orders to let a patient get ivermectin, I want to point out, the hospitals normally refuse to honor the court order. But these are battles that the families are waging because out of frustration, they're turning to ivermectin. Now, I have to say, ivermectin, we always thought was, one of the good things for early treatment. It seemed to work effectively in India, for example. But we have proof now, several of these court cases that have been won successfully, patients on their deathbed in ICUs, actually got ivermectin and walked out of the hospital completely well, cured at a very late stage in terms of COVID disease. So for some reason, I don't even understand the biology or the physics of it, why ivermectin is working on patients who are intubated and seriously ill on their deathbed, given a 10% chance of living by the hospital doctors. And yet we have these cases where they are successfully treated with ivermectin at a very late stage.
It appears to have basically very negligible risk. It can be given down the nasogastric tube in an intubated patient,
yes.
orally. We would do that for a patient with a parasitic infection or scabies anyway. And we know now, we found the dose, 600 micrograms per kilogram. And as Dr. Hirschhorn pointed out, the analyses show, unlike hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin works deep into the illness, probably because of its direct anti-spike protein capability. We now know the spike protein is a dangerous part of the virus. The only drug that has some blocking effect on the spike protein is ivermectin at a high enough dose. Now, it does other things. It blocks nuclear entry of the virus and actually has some effect on various kinases within the cell. That actually may play a role late in the inflammatory phase of the illness. But, ivermectin falls into the category. Why not? Yeah. Virtually everyone in the hospital, all the deaths occur in the hospital. So the hospital is the arena for COVID-19 deaths. That's when we're basically throwing in the kitchen sink. Each and every patient who's sick with COVID-19 in the hospital all over the world should receive a fair trial of ivermectin, 600 micrograms per kilogram per day. Why not? Can't hurt, and you have nothing to lose there. And patients are willing to go to court for it. And hospitals and doctors should participate in shared decision-making and let the families and patients and the doctors decide together.
But Ricky, I just want to point out that about 90% of these court cases trying to get ivermectin to the patient have failed, okay? Probably at least 90% have failed. So only about 10% have succeeded. And I'm just reading about a new case. They got the ivermectin in very late in the game, and they only got, I think, 2 or 3 doses, and the patient did die. But we're talking about people who are in ICUs sometimes for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or even longer, okay? These are seriously ill patients, and yet the hospitals are still fighting these court orders to try the ivermectin. It's so, are we winning? You asked, are we winning? Well, in the case of late use of ivermectin, we're losing in terms of statistical court cases.
That's because 90% of them aren't named Ralph Larigo. I would strongly suggest anyone in need of help in the hospital contact Ralph. I was in contact with him this weekend. We had a couple of critical cases at We the Patriots USA that came to us this weekend. One was a gentleman, a 28-year-old in Topeka, Kansas, who had been placed on a vent, according to his family, against his will. And another was one in, where was the other one? Nevada. And he was able to jump in and help both of them. And he's in New York. Ralph Larigo is in New York, for those of you who don't know him. So if anyone needs to get in touch with him, you can reach out to him directly, or if you can't, reach out to We the Patriots USA, and we'd be happy to help.
Well, I published an article about this subject, and I gave the contact information for that attorney. Okay, I wanted to help the readers of my articles. Okay, but he hasn't won all of his cases. He's done very well.
No, he hasn't, but he's the one I'd go to out of everyone in the country. He's the one I'd go to.
Absolutely correct.
I have a question for the doctors. Is there really such a thing as long COVID? And would you suggest someone take ivermectin after the fact for that reason?
There definitely is a long COVID syndrome. We were actually stunned with data from Bruce Patterson that was published in preprint July 29th. And he identified the S1 segment of the virus spike protein in human monocytes up to 15 months after the respiratory infection. So, and I interviewed Bruce for the McCullough report on America Out Loud Talk Radio. And Bruce says he has data now in the vaccinated, and both the S1 and the S2 spike protein is found many months, actually as long as he can look, after vaccination. We know the spike protein is what gets deposited into the brain, the muscles, heart. It's literally found everywhere when looked for on autopsy. And now that we know it persists in the body for a very long period of time, it makes a lot of sense that long COVID is those who had a heavy exposure to the spike protein. In published studies, 50% of those admitted to the ICU with respiratory COVID will end up with some long COVID syndromes, probably because of persistent spike protein in the body. It means like a long time for phagocytosis to clear it out. I asked Bruce, I said, is there any other illness where the organism deposits something in the body for that long a period of time? He said, yes. And I said, what's the example? He said Lyme disease, that there's remnants of Borrelia burgdorferi in the body for many months, even over a year in Lyme disease. No wonder there's a post-Lyme syndrome. No wonder there's a post-COVID, long COVID syndrome. So I'd point the listeners to a suggested protocol. There are no randomized trial yet, but a suggested protocol by the Frontline Critical Care Consortium, flcc.net. And they have a protocol called iRecover, and it does list ivermectin as a choice. I can tell you, I see this in my clinical practice. If it's neurological, I end up featuring fluvoxamine, which has been supported by 3 clinical trials in acute COVID, including a recent trial from Brazil. And it has, I think, the right profile for neurologic symptoms of long COVID. And if there's any pleural or pericardial chest symptoms, I end up using colchicine, again, supported by the Corona trial in acute COVID, and having good results. Many of both these overlay syndromes, we end up using prednisone. I know other doctors that are working closely with ivermectin are featuring ivermectin for a prolonged period of time in the long COVID syndrome. Just another reason why our pharmacists, our American Board of Pharmacy and American Medical Association, they need to drop all their efforts to abolish the use of ivermectin. You know, the American Medical Association has an initiative to actually abolish the use of ivermectin right now. It's an official stated objective as of early September.
What's your opinion on why they're behaving that way?
You know, it may be what's called regulatory capture. There's so much money flowing to various organizations right now in order to conjure up support for the mass vaccination program, that as part of regulatory capture, you know, when this money comes into the CFOs, they may do a check down on talking points. I know most health systems have issued talking points over and over again, not to use hydroxychloroquine, not to use ivermectin, to only stay in line with CDC, NIH, and FDA, you know, sponsored types of protocols and statements. One of the disingenuous statements that we get as talking points is, you know, no use of a drug outside of a research protocol, but then there's no research protocol offered. So the poor patient doesn't have, you know, it's like, okay, you know, I'll be in a research protocol. Where's the research protocol? Well, there isn't any. So, you know, so it's basically obviating use of important drugs to suffering patients. Doctors need the full support now of all government agencies, of all stakeholders, in order to let doctors be doctors. You know, in 2018, the FDA had a nice statement to the public telling them, why do doctors use drugs off label, off the original advertised label? It's when they're fulfilling an unmet need. Well, let me tell you what, acute and now long COVID syndromes are a clear unmet need. They are strongly supported by the FDA stance on this, that they should use drugs off label, and all the other stakeholders who are trying to stop this appropriate clinically indicated off-label use should cease and desist. The Association of American Physicians and Surgeons has sent an official cease and desist letter to the AMA saying, listen, stop it. Let doctors be doctors.
Exactly. And, you know, we've lost medical freedom. And I've written a few articles lately about the use of personalized medicine as a way to understand what we need to let doctors do. Doctors should, you know, make the medicine fit the patient. Okay. That's personalized medicine, not this mass approach, government dictated approach. Everyone use the same solution. Everyone get vaccinated. That is the opposite of medical freedom. It is the opposite of personalized medicine.
Quick question for the doctor, since while we still have you here, Dr. McCullough. Refresh my memory. It is not normal for professional soccer players, former recently retired all-pro wide receivers, and children to drop dead from heart attacks, correct?
That's true.
Is it reasonable to make a connection between the unveiling of the new vaccines and the recent spat of heart attack deaths in very well trained athletes and young children?
Well, here's the chain of logic. Our FDA has told Americans that the Pfizer and Moderna messenger RNA vaccines cause myocarditis. They've clearly said that. So that warning is clearly out there. The CDC had about 200 cases in June that were, you know, pretty serious myocarditis. They were kids and they were hospitalized. Okay. And they were sick. They had really evidence of heart damage, by multiple different methods of assessment. Now, the CDC VAERS system has over 15,000 cases. And we know a young person's group are athletes. And athletes have been told by their teams that they should take the vaccine. Now, many of them have various contractual, options of non-disclosure where they simply don't have to disclose their vaccine status and they can bypass the vaccine. That's what Aaron Rodgers did, as an example. He didn't take the vaccine. So many may not, maybe many U.S. athletes have not taken the vaccine. But I have to tell you, I'm suspicious in Europe because that's where we've seen this rash of deaths. There's a montage of athletes. I think they're nearly up to 200 athletes that have died on the field. I'm a cardiologist. I can tell you the leading cause of death on the field is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And we screen all the athletes now for this with EKG and echocardiography. So, that we don't see deaths on the field anymore because, basically the most common cause is screened out. And so with myocarditis, part of the treatment of myocarditis is basically rest from physical activity. The guidelines say that an athlete couldn't exercise for 3 to 6 months once they develop myocarditis. So the question is, are these athletes taking the vaccine? And are they actually either having subclinical symptoms or having symptoms they ignore because, they want to be on the pitch playing and they know their contract is on the line? And are they playing through vaccine-induced myocarditis? And then we know them. By the way, we know when that happens, one of the outcomes can be sudden death on the playing field.
Scott, you had a question also?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hey, Dr. McCullough, good to see you again. Scott from Krystal. Just real quick. So you made a very convincing case today. I listened to the Rogan interview this morning, about not only the premeditation, but just the crime that basically was committed. You're saying up to 90% of these deaths could have been prevented. And I know right now there's a lot of focus on Fauci, for example, a lot of scrutiny with Fauci and very well deserving. But I was wondering your opinion, and Dr. Hirschhorn, good to see you as well. If you guys have any input on this, what other entities? Are there other entities out there that deserve equal scrutiny, whether it's agencies or government officials or in the private big pharma area, anything that's just as equally culpable? Or who do you think, whose hands have the blood on them right now, would you say?
I'll defer to Dr. Hirschhorn. He's done a lot of scholarship on this.
Yeah, I would say absolutely, unequivocally, Fauci is the key person. I've been working in the Washington area, and I've worked for Congress, and I've done a lot of work in government. And I can tell you for sure, Fauci has been controlling not only NIH, but FDA and CDC. He is the power behind the throne. He is the power behind the whole public health establishment, okay? It is Fauci. If you remove Fauci, I think we'd have a more of a winning chance here. So I think he is the most evil person. He has been wrong on absolutely everything. And what I've been trying to do in my recent articles is keep pointing out all of the positive things that he could have promoted from the very beginning of the pandemic. It could have been hydroxy. It could have been, ivermectin. It could have been vitamin D. It should have been a fight against obesity. 30% of hospitalized COVID patients, 30% are obese. He should have done, as a public health person, he should have been promoting a lot of positive things. Home testing. Why didn't we get established cheap, really cheap or free home testing kits? If they can pay for vaccines, right? Why didn't the government think about paying for home testing kits like they've done in the United Kingdom? So I think Fauci has gotten it all wrong. Total mismanagement of the pandemic.
What about in the private sector? Is there anybody we can point to there?
Well, I always, of course, say follow the money. All of these top executives of Pfizer and Moderna, they've all become billionaires because of not just $1 billion, but maybe $1 trillion market for the vaccines. When we start to try to think about why aren't we doing this ivermectin or doing whatever, vitamin D, you have to always understand that anything that presents an alternative to vaccines is condemned by Fauci and the government structure and the public health establishment structure, which includes academics. Where do the professors working in public health, where do they get their funding from? Fauci. Fauci gives out an incredible amount of billions of dollars a year to academics. They will not speak up and lose their funding, okay? The journals, all of the big mainstream journals, where do they get their advertising from? Big drug companies, okay? So everywhere you look, I see follow the money, and the money has corrupted the system. Fauci has been totally corrupt.
Thank you.
This is a great segue. I want to kind of throw in here. I think my organization, the Art of Liberty Foundation, in May of 2020, I believe that we were the first one to do a multi-investigation into the COVID from the aspect that this was an engineered event brought on by, organized crime interests that had engineered what was not really a pandemic. Since that time, many others have now come forward. David Martin is naming names. At the recent Red Pill Expo, he released a list of what he calls the privateers and the pirates behind the engineered event of the COVID. Rainer Fulmich in Germany is leading a group that I understand totals over 1,000 attorneys and 10,000 public health professionals, calling for a Nuremberg 2. RFK has got his new book essentially accusing Fauci of criminality, outright. What other investigations and what is the best evidence that the crew here has that this was an engineered event to sell vaccines, to hand trillions of dollars to private companies, private banks through the bailouts and the stimulus? All the other evidence of criminality. Would anybody like to throw out what their best evidence is?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and sign off.
A lot of different things there, and I want to kind of bring it back a little bit. So number one,
powerful story.
It is a powerful story. You have the watches, we have the time. Absolutely, it tells you who has leverage because it's a story of patience. Okay, it's outlast. We're going to outlast you, and eventually we'll flip on you, and we'll get what we want.
We'll outbleed you.
But this is the point I want to make to you. So number one, you said Trump is what word did you call him? You said he's a sweetheart, he's brilliant, he's a genius. What was the word you used? I forgot.
Moron.
Okay, that's the word you used. And you said because he pretty much gave him a what? That we're going to, by July, the contracts, all this other stuff.
It's the worst deal on the planet.
You leave a little bit out, though. You leave a little bit out.
Worst deal on the planet.
Listen, you sound like the part that I'm going to give you a little bit of pushback. Here's the following. Why is it that the one thing Obama and Biden have in common, everything bad that happened during their administration was Bush's fault and Trump's fault? Why is that?
I don't understand. Why was it that everything bad thing that happened in Trump's administration was Obama's fault?
But wait a minute.
I think that's part and parcel for every American president.
But then what you're doing is you're playing to that. So set that part aside because the agreement, if you look, let me finish. I've listened to you for 10 minutes.
Yep.
The agreement was, yes, here's the contract in July, but it was also we leave properly in May in the right sequence. The biggest challenge with here is Trump's not the president anymore. So you can't say, oh, it's Trump's watch. It is not on Trump's watch. They can sit there and say whatever they want to say about this guy. Trump, he was this, he was that, he was this. He's a negotiator. He enjoys it. I think he's a guy that gets a kick out of sitting there, and he thinks he can outsmart some of these guys. You can't outsmart shady people. And the Taliban, you're not sitting down with business people. This is not like businessmen and women that you're dealing with law and order and rules and guidelines and all these different regulations that you got to deal with. They don't give a shit about law and order. You're not dealing with people that are reasonable like you. So I agree with you on that side. You don't the famous line with Reagan. What was famous line with Reagan? We don't negotiate with terrorists. That's a famous line. Okay, well, he did. There's no reason to negotiate there. However, bring it to today. Biden has all these people around him. You claim you listen to your generals. You got Milley, when they went through that whole thing, nobody answered anything. They were afraid to blame Biden. They were afraid to take responsibility because their careers was on it. People are just kind of sitting there saying it was as if everybody was walking on eggshells, and we learned nothing about what happened. So maybe the July agreement was a negotiation, but I don't put Trump as a dummy because when people sit there and try to underestimate this guy with being a dummy, I don't think anybody we've had as a president the last 30, 40 years has more experience negotiating with others in any kind of capacity than this guy does in the area of negotiation. Now, does he have foreign policy negotiation experience like some of these other guys we've had? No. Obama was a one-term senator. How much experience does the guy have? None. Bush lineage. He comes with a lot of experience. He's one phone call away from calling a guy that was a former director of CIA. You know what he's going to get from that guy? He's going to get some kind of counsel, and he's been in that life his entire life. He's had drinks, food, dinner with some of the most powerful people in the world. So he's a phone call away from anybody, right? So I get Bush. I get Senior because of Prescott, you know, the grandfather. I don't even get Clinton, but Clinton, maybe a little bit of experience with governor. Yeah,
Rhodes Scholar.
Totally
I
fine.
mean,
I get that. I give it to him. But Biden, dude, 43 years. Did you hear what he said in 08 about leaving Afghanistan? But wait a minute. Do you remember what he said in 08 about his...
I was there.
Okay.
I worked...
He said, if we ever leave, we cannot leave equipment behind. We cannot do this. Do you understand? This is billions of dollars.
Don't you know the old adage in Washington?
Exact opposite thing.
Don't you know the old saying in Washington?
What's that?
Show me a foreign policy issue Joe Biden's been a part of, and I'll show you... The line is, show me a foreign policy issue, and I'll show you an example in which Joe Biden's been wrong. Like Joe Biden in Washington is always considered to be
Never
on the wrong side.
underestimate Joe Biden's ability to fuck things up. Barack Obama.
So I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency during the Obama administration and the Bush administration, and I worked on Afghanistan. I specifically was part of the debate for what's called the surge.
Yeah.
Okay. At that time, the vice president, Biden, was the biggest proponent of something we called CT Light, counterterrorism light. The idea was that so Stan McChrystal wanted this surge of 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. And I understood why. Because at that point, you have to understand, at that point, all of the...
Segue here to talk about Afghanistan, actually. One of the big moments where Joe Biden flipped, the Democrats' approval, not just Biden, but Democrats in general, hit the gutter was Afghanistan. So back in August, you see this inflection point in the polling where that's where Joe Biden went from approved to disapproved. And it was his fuck up in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
and look, we were mentioning it before. I mean, you had a big role to play in the Trump administration over what the Afghanistan plan was.
Yes, Chief of Staff at DOD, the president asked me to end the forever wars. He campaigned on them. He's like, Kash, get us out of Syria, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, and Afghanistan. And so I said, okay, we have to do this smartly. We've been there for a long time, a lot of blood and treasure on the ground. So we issued a conditions-based withdrawal where we were never going to give up Bagram, our brain center and country. We were going to get Americans out first, and we were going to secure our facilities and compounds, leave a special forces contingent in place because terrorism is always going to be an issue in Afghanistan. And we're going to have the diplomatic talks occur on the parallel track with the diplomats, because you can't. It's Afghanistan. Who's going to govern Afghanistan?
Yeah. Wait. So you're saying like there would have been an American special forces remaining in Afghanistan?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we would have kept Bagram.
Kept Bagram, and then basically
we keep our drone strike capability. We keep our allies in place that want to stay. We don't just up and leave. We had an actual plan.
So what did Joe Biden end up doing?
So we handed this off to Joe Biden because they excoriated us for not transitioning, but we gave them the biggest transition in DOD presidential history. And I said literally, call it the Biden plan. Call it the Harris. I don't care what you call it. It's working. They're at the table. They're negotiating. It's going to take more time. By the way, this is the fact that I'm most proud of. Not one American service member died during our conditions-based withdrawal plan. They took it and they said, we're going to politicize the national security apparatus in America. What did Donald Trump do? X, we're doing Y. So he tells the Taliban literally go pound sand. The Taliban says, okay, we're going to wait. Wait 6 months. 6 months later, it's not a withdrawal. It's an evacuation. Afghans are falling out of the air from cargo planes, our American cargo planes, and 13 American service members get killed by who? A terrorist we let out of Bagram that we used to hold, that Joe Biden gave away to the enemy, and he killed our service members.
I've always been, like one of the big things for me why I voted for Trump in 2020 was withdraw from Afghanistan, like follow through on this stuff. I thought a change in leadership would be bad. Democrat could get in and just be like, no, we want the wars, or neocon or whoever. And so that to me was pretty good. However,
government, and yet they can't seem to accomplish anything. And you're right. They don't seem to be a party that cares about the average American worker anymore. And I think that's honestly why Hillary, one of the biggest reasons why Hillary was a terrible candidate to run in the first place, considering where she was politically in terms of how the American people saw her.
Agreed, but I agree with you. She had active disdain for the plebeian.
And that's the thing about it, right? Is Trump appealed to a bunch of people who feel like they've been left behind, that they've been abandoned, right? That nobody has their back.
Because they have been.
Right. They have been. And I don't know if there is a party in this country that speaks to those people anymore. I really don't. I don't think the Republican Party, by the way, is a party anymore. I think it's a cult. It's a cult of personality. when friends of mine like Adam,
it's a common enemy.
When friends of mine like Adam Kinzinger and Pete Meyer don't have a home, right? When they're being
Justin Amish,
when they're being actively primaried, like Adam's a great guy. He's a true American. He's a patriot. He gives a shit about this country, right? Pete Meyer has been a friend of mine for 15 years, right? Pete gives a damn about this country to the point that he got on a plane and flew to Afghanistan in the middle of the evacuation trying to help out. Just because he thought as a vet and a member of Congress, he might be able to get people through the gate faster. Like, he took a lot of shit for that, by the way, for what he did, because people called it a political stunt. He was just going over there trying to help out. Like, he's a guy who gives it. These are all people who are being actively targeted because they didn't bend the knee to the dictator. And that's what frightens me about Trump. This idea that if you are, I'll give you my favorite example. One of my business partners is a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. During the 2016 election, he entered the election by bundling cash for Jeb Bush. When Jeb Bush dropped out, he wrote one paper, a national security policy position paper for Lindsey Graham. Because he wrote a position for Graham in the primary, the Trump world deemed him not politically allegiant enough to ever serve in the Trump White House. He was banned. He was banned. He told me, I cannot get a job in this administration because I didn't show enough fealty. That terrifies the fuck out of me. That's such mafioso shit. That's not how you get good governance. That's how you get nepotism.
What are you talking about though? Like, Matt, like you say a comment like that, you got to look at it on the other side as well. You just talked about on the Biden side, we opened up the meeting with saying, how come they haven't had you on media since 3-4 months ago?
Because they don't want to hear the truth.
Yeah, so this isn't loyalty is expected from both sides.
And
don't get it twisted. This is not like
awful.
I don't disagree that it's awful, but loyalty is expected from both sides. You can't just look at it from the one side to the other side. So
no, listen. I'm not here to listen. I'm just bringing up. I bring up Trump because I personally hate the guy. Okay, and I think he is honestly the biggest threat to this country's long-term survivability. I know that you guys might be fans, but that man is.
No, I'm not a Trump fan.
I'll put it in 2017. I'll show you the notes. You can take a look at. What does that say? What date is on that?
January 1817.
January 18, 2017. These are notes that I wrote 2 days before he took office. It's entitled How They Take Over, or If I Were Putin, Here's How I'd Take Over. The guy is a Russian asset. And I know you don't want to hear this, but I'm telling you this is someone who used to. No,
gosh,
I worked.
The Steele dossier?
It's not the Steele. Listen, it's his behavior. Why is it that he meets with Putin one-on-one without translators in the room and we never get a transcript from it? Why? Because he's checking in with his fucking handler. All right? I used to do this for a living. You don't think I can look and see? You don't think I can look across the table and see somebody that I would have recruited? He's a fucking.
You lost me there, bro. You lost me there.
Hold on. Explain why.
Yeah.
Explain why.
All right. So the Russian playbook is all about what's called disinformation, compromise.
Sure.
Compromising.
I had Jack Barsky on 2 weeks ago. He's a former KGB. I'm fully aware of what you're talking about.
So look at how Trump then engaged with the American people. Anytime he was criticized, it's fake news. He went and targeted people who wouldn't bend the knee. Look who got attacked constantly by Trump world. McCain in particular. They went after John McCain. Why? Because he was the only member of the party with enough clout that might be able to push back on his cult of personality. So what do? They try to go after his legacy. They try to go after and get compromising information to him. Why is it that Lindsey Graham flips like this? Lindsey flips like this because Lindsey is gayer than the day is long, and he's afraid that if that comes out in South Carolina, he doesn't get reelected. That's why he suddenly goes from being John McCain's best friend. I remembered them when they were. I used to hang out with these people. I saw them. They were dear friends.
You're dropping some absolute bombs right
and
now.
What you're telling,
what does this have to do with Russia? Go back to the Russia.
What I'm telling
topic.
you this is that. So
make your point on Russia. That's what I'm curious.
Trump is trained to act like a Russian asset would. He's trained to take over power in the way a Russian asset, if they were in place, would. Look at what he's gotten us to do. In 4 years, we all now yell at each other. We don't trust anything.
That was Obama's second term that started.
But we really don't trust it now. He poured jet fuel onto it. Why? If you're an American president, is your job to unite and lead this country and make it better?
Oh my God.
Or is it, hold on, do you feel like you came out of that presidency more united or more divided?
More divided, for sure.
Okay, hold on. I listened to you guys talk for 10 minutes. My turn.
Sure.
All right. If you feel like you came out of it more divided, let me ask you this. What is the job of the American president? It's to fight for this country. It's to make this country great again, for example. You really feel like you came out of this great? You really feel that the animosity and the strife that we all feel when we talk about this son of a bitch is good? No, this is exactly what our enemies wanted.
I agree with that.
This is Putin's wet fucking dream. And so this is what I come back to. I went to a birthday party 2 weeks after the 2016 election. It was a bunch of Polish family. They had come here. They'd grown up in Poland under communism.
Yeah.
I was standing on the back deck with the dad.
Convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid at the time. Well, they made some genuine, substantial changes institutionally and with people.
We'll advance from here. Talk about Ukraine Gate. So this is where they actually impeached Donald Trump with the lies about Ukraine. And the crazy thing was, I was tracking the news. I was looking at European news sources. I was looking at the history of the founder of Burisma. This is the company where Hunter Biden, the president's son, was a board member. And my conclusion on this was like, okay, first, I entertained Russiagate. You know, like I'm just like reading the news. I'm like, wow, this is crazy stuff. I actually met with one of the most high-profile Russiagate journalists and asked them, like, to their face, looked in their eyes, do you think Trump actually did this? And they were like, without a doubt, he did. And I was like, wow. And I'm like, I'm at a bar with one of these like, you know, mainstream media journalists telling me like, bro, we have the proof. I've seen it. And I'm like, wow. And it's all fake. So then Ukraine Gate comes along, and this is where, you know, Trump apparently sees a video on Twitter of Joe Biden being like, if you want the aid, you got to fire the prosecutor. So Trump just is like, I wonder what that's about. I'm not necessarily trying to rehash Ukraine Gate, but to point out, you end up with these journalists like Matt Taibbi.
Yeah, great guy.
Formerly of Rolling Stone, real journalist, and he's a liberal guy.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden now he's an alt-right grifter.
And same with Aaron Mate. You know?
Right, Aaron Mate, he's a progressive.
Yeah. I've done both those guys. I've interviewed both those guys, done podcasts with both those guys. We could not be more politically opposed to each other. But there used to be a time when you could be a real journalist, as you're talking about. And if there's corruption or illegality, you would call it out if it was right or left. Those seem to be the only guys on the left that want to do it anymore.
Well, this is the crazy thing, right? Jimmy Dore. Are you familiar with Jimmy Dore?
No.
Jimmy Dore is, I think, I'm not trying to be unfair, but I think he's a socialist.
I think so.
Yeah,
Jimmy?
He's like a Bernie Sanders supporter.
Yeah. He's far left, but he's honest. And he calls out the establishment. He calls out all this stuff. He gets called alt-right. It's the craziest thing when you're like, the Democratic establishment is corrupt and they're doing all these awful things. The weirdest thing to me is when I get, you know, people who don't understand what's going on. This is one of the challenges we face. It's really hard to understand Russiagate. So many people, Fiona Hill, who is she? What is her involvement? And now you're Igor Danchenko. Like, who are these people? What does this mean? Ukraine Gate, really complicated. But when you follow journalists like Matt Taibbi, who's a liberal, they have no choice but to say he's right wing, because here's a guy who's always been kind of a lefty dude, a liberal, challenging their narrative, but regular people believe it.
And it's crazy. It's crazy. And that's what I'm talking about with the course correction. I think you're talking about that the media needs to undertake. And people are like, is that ever going to happen? And I think that's a multi-year lift. You know, guys like Taibbi and Mate right now are helping try to correct the record. And they're getting a bigger audience, and as are you through your show. But, you know, you're right. Russiagate's super complicated. But the only thing you need to know about what is Russiagate, literally, the media helped perpetrate the biggest fraud in presidential history because a political campaign paid them and their cronies to do it.
And this jammed. You were in the Trump administration from the beginning, right?
Halfway through.
Yeah. This jammed up the first 2 years of the Trump administration.
Oh yeah. I mean, you were you guys all lived it. I was living it differently on Capitol Hill, getting called a genocidal dictator, literally in the media, because I was the guy exposing the truth, like facts. I was putting facts out through the right process and not leaking classified information. And so, that is just, they spent the first 2 years basically the Trump administration fending off, saying, I'm not in bed with Putin.
Looking at Ukraine Gate, this is where Trump got impeached the first time. Second time was just ridiculous because he wasn't even, in the office anymore. But Ukraine Gate was absolutely insane. I took, a few minutes to go over the initial reports, and I was like, wow, this is a crazy story. You had, long story short, for those who aren't familiar, this is where they impeached Trump the first time. They claimed he was abusing his power to dig up dirt on Joe Biden because Joe Biden was his rival, even though Joe Biden hadn't announced he was running for office and wasn't officially running for office. And when you actually look at the evidence, Matt Taibbi, who we've mentioned several times, an amazing journalist, found there was a criminal investigation from Viktor Shokin, the prosecutor, into McCullough Zlochevsky, the founder of this energy company where Joe Biden's son was on the board. The media lied over and over again saying there was no investigation. It's not true. Ignore this. Trump is abusing his power. It was really crazy for me because when Russiagate was happening, I was like, wow, the New York Times, they said this.
Incredible.
Then Ukraine Gate comes along and I'm like, wait a minute. The evidence actually proves they're lying.
And they released the call transcript between Trump and the Ukraine premier where that literally showed there was no quid pro quo. And if you take that and put it next to Joe Biden's quid pro quo for his son getting an advisory contract in Ukraine and saying, I'm going to fire the prosecutor or you're not getting your $7 million in aid. I mean,
or it was billion. Was it $1 billion?
Was it $1 billion? Yeah, whatever it was. But that's quid pro quo.
Joe Biden should be impeached. If the Republicans win back the House, the first thing they should do is impeach Joe Biden. And it's not just the Ukraine stuff. It is flying his son on Air Force 2 to China for private equity deals.
How much did he make? I forget, like $2 million, $3 million. I can't remember.
I don't know if they actually did the deal, but there was one report. I could be getting the details wrong, so fact check me on this one, guys. It's been a while since I reported on this. But they received a forgivable loan of like $5 million or something. Okay. So it was like they had a meeting and said, we're not going to do business, but here's a forgivable loan.
I want a forgivable loan.
I'd love to get a $5 million forgivable loan. It was something like that. But you also have now the photos emerging of Joe Biden with Hunter Biden's business associates when he said, I never talked to them. And you have new revelations from the Hunter Biden laptop showing that Joe Biden and Hunter shared a bank account. Yeah. This is so far beyond. And I think it's really obvious. The Trump supporters called it out. When this was going down, they said the left is projecting what they did onto Trump as a defense to stop the investigation of themselves.
No, and this is the biggest bottom line takeaway from all of this. For 5 years, everybody said Trump was colluding with Russia to corrupt an election and the U.S. government. What we have now shown, not we, Durham and our investigations have shown, is that the only people that colluded with Russians were the Hillary Clinton campaign, the Democratic Party, and certain FBI individuals, including James Comey, Andy McCabe, and the likes of those people that should be indicted. I mean, that's how crazy this scenario is, and that's why people were like, we can't believe what you're saying. And this is what people want. This is what everybody, when I go around the country, they're like, look, I don't need to understand Russiagate. I don't need to understand Ukraine Gate. What I need to understand is where's the accountability? Why is there a different set of rules for them? And why is there another set of rules for me if I screw up?
I think we're in trouble because they're getting away with it. I don't know where we'll go with the Durham investigation. Maybe
I think we're in a good place.
You think they'll actually end up going after these key players in this? I feel like they'll throw some people under the bus and let the big dogs get away with it.
Well, look, don't get me wrong. I don't think Hillary Clinton's getting indicted or James Comey's getting indicted, but I do think Andy McCabe, Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, and Fusion GPS and all these people are in the crosshairs. And I don't think that they're now starting it. Durham already started it. He issued 20 and 30 and 40 page indictments that are normally 2 to 3 pages long. Why did he do that? Because it's the only way he can legally speak to the American public in an indictment to say, this is what I'm doing. Wow. And he laid out 10 people per indictment, like a mob-style conspiracy. He supported it with bank documents saying, I've got the documents. I don't have something that says I have a phone call that John paid Joe $10. I've got $1 million bank wire. That's how he's built this case and the one that we just talked about. So I think he's going to flip up.
I was talking to someone recently who told me that they viewed themselves as a Democrat if they had to choose. And then later in the conversation said they were quitting their job because they didn't want to get vaccine boosters like every other month or whatever. And it was like endless. And I was like, but the Democratic Party are the ones who are enforcing those and pushing those. And it's the Republicans, for the most part, who are rejecting them.
With that deep dive from Insider into corruption, they took a look at every member of the House, every member of the Senate. They evaluated all of their stock trades and their portfolios. They matched them up with the committees that they sit on to see, you know, where they might have special insight and be able to direct policy and legislation. They also, as I mentioned before, they looked at the staff because especially, I mean, this varies a lot member to member. Some members are more like actually in charge in their office and some are, you know, really influenced by the people that they have around them from their chief of staff to their legislative directors. So it matters a lot what those staff members are doing as well, which is why they were also included in the Stock Act, which forces disclosure both for members of Congress, but also for their aides. Let's go ahead and throw this tear sheet up on the screen. They say we rated every member of Congress on their financial conflicts and transparency. Part of what they say is dozens of federal lawmakers and at least 182 top congressional staffers are violating a federal conflict of interest law known as the Stock Act. Others are failing to avoid clashes between their personal finances and public duties. So the two pieces there are, number one, some of these people, a lot of these people actually are in violation of the law of the Stock Act. Others, what they may be doing is not illegal, but it probably should be.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of the conflicts of interest directly, you know, impacting the country, impacting the trades that they're making here. This is obviously something that we've tracked quite closely. So very interested to see the results of this. What they say here is in Washington, D.C., one bipartisan phenomenon is thriving. Numerous members of Congress, both liberal and conservative, are united in their demonstrated indifference toward a law designed to quash corruption and curb conflicts of interest. Insider's new investigative reporting project, Conflicted Congress, chronicles the myriad ways that members of the U.S. House and Senate have eviscerated their own ethical standards, avoided consequences, and blinded Americans to the many moments when lawmakers' personal finances clash with their public duties. Very strong language, and what is uncovered is quite significant. Let's go ahead and put who are the worst of the worst here. They graded everybody. You can see the graphic there along the left. Democrat, Republican, and Independent. They graded everybody as solid, borderline, or danger. You can see the numbers between Dems and Republicans. There's a few more Republicans, but really quite a bipartisan phenomenon. And that's the picture there. We have 14 members of Congress who are rated as danger. Dianne Feinstein is there, Senator. Yep. Senator Tommy Tuberville is also, is it Tuberville or Tuberville?
I think Tuberville. I don't know.
We'll go with Tuberville.
We're showing that we don't watch football, but.
Yeah, totally. Sean Patrick Maloney, who is head of the DCCC. So number of members here that are sort of the worst offenders in terms of violating the Stock Act or not taking proactive steps to avoid potential conflicts of interest. A lot of the excuses that these lawmakers give, I mean, it's all the classic things that we've heard. Oh, it's my wife's stock. Yeah. Oh, I have nothing to do with that. Oh, I had no idea. And of course I uphold the highest of ethical standards. And oh, I didn't disclose that. I just forgot. I didn't get the information from my husband or my trader or whoever until it was too late. So, the excuses are what they are. But let's go ahead and throw this next piece up on the screen. So they took this data and then they broke it down into different individual articles. One of them highly significant here, as the pandemic raged, at least 75 lawmakers bought and sold stock in companies that make COVID-19 vaccines, treatments, and tests. They also track 15 lawmakers tasked with shaping U.S. defense policy that actively invest in military contractors. They caught more than a dozen environmentally minded Democrats who are investing in fossil fuel companies. I mean, it just exposes how full of it these people are when they claim to be public servants, when they claim to be above the fray, when they claim to be acting in the public interest. And even some of the positions that they claim to hold, those are in direct conflict with some of the things that they are investing in and making money off of.
No, absolutely. I think going through each of these things just gives you a way in order to comprehend the scale. So just one of these, Representative Pat Fallon, he was the first one on that danger list. He had 118 violations of the Stock Act with up to $9 million in trades. The member said that they paid any fines, but they did not provide any proof. Okay, so that's just one. What about the next one? Whenever we go and we look at Dianne Feinstein, I mean, this is a person who had a late disclosure, but totaling thousands of dollars in terms of her Stock Act violation. All of them. Many of them are ones that you haven't even heard of. But like you said, one of these people is the head of the DCCC. And yet, whenever you look at Sean Patrick Maloney, we're talking about up to 8 different trades that he also refused to comment or didn't even respond on whether he had done anything. I just gave you a small sampling of the 3 of the 13. And, you know, the other thing that gets me is when you look at the most popular stocks which are owned by Congress, this matters a lot, right, in terms of potential regulation. Well, what do you guys think they are? Well, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Disney, Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan and Chase, Pfizer, Berkshire Hathaway, ExxonMobil, Procter & Gamble. I just read off technology, energy sector, and financial sector. Those are probably the 3 most intertwined sectors with government. In terms of what's before government right now, it is absolutely, are we gonna do anything about tech? What does that even mean? Are we gonna do anything about energy, fossil fuel, infrastructure bill, financial regulation? I mean, that's a long-standing tradition here in DC. Now, you would have to be a fool to think that your ownership in these companies is not gonna, at least in some way, impact how you decide to vote. I mean, does anybody truly believe that? And this isn't to cast aspersions on them. This is to say they're normal human beings. Most people, if you own something, well, when something bad happens, or, you know, are you really gonna vote directly against your financial interests? The whole point is, let's not even let people get into that situation. And, you know, the more you look at this stuff, like even Berkshire Class B stock, like high net worth individuals. Alibaba is also on there. Love that. You know, Chinese corporation. Awesome for American congressional members. And the more I look into the list, what I'm just struck by is just how bipartisan it all is. How it also permeates basically every single sector. Like you said, 15 people who serve on the defense committees getting defense stock. 75 lawmakers buying and selling stock in the COVID vaccines. Democrats who are hailed as environmental champions who are buying and selling fossil fuels. Members of Congress who publicly blast Facebook but quietly invest all their savings in Facebook. I mean, and 182 high-ranking congressional staffers have violated federal conflict of interest laws with overdue disclosure of their personal stock trades. I have an idea. When you work there or whenever you serve there, you can't sell stock. I know. That sucks. But, you know, it's a choice. Nobody forced you to do this.
Right.
You signed up and you ran for election in order to do this. You don't have a constitutional right in order to day trade stocks while you're a member of the
Based
U.S.
on the
Congress.
insider info you're getting as a public servant. I mean, that's the thing that I always come back to is those words just become so meaningless. Like, yeah, it's no big deal to ask somebody to sacrifice a small amount, right? You can't day trade while you're in Congress? Big deal. Or even, I mean, the other big thing is that this is one aspect of it, the way that they're profiting off of the knowledge they have sitting on these committees. The other aspect of it is, of course, how they line themselves up for whatever career they're going to do after they leave Congress when they feel entitled to enter the, you know, elite 0.1% and make tons of money and cash in. They want to go live, most of them are already millionaires, and they want to continue going and living the life that the donor class is living. I mean, those are their closest friends. Those are the people they spend the most time with in Congress, and that's the social set that they are a part of and see themselves as continuing to be a part of. And one thing that always we see with these is even the wealthiest members who have millions, tens of millions, in some instances hundreds of millions of dollars, it's never enough for them.
Like Nancy Pelosi is a person.
You still got to trade based on your knowledge of, you know, what's going on in Congress. You still got to be out there day trying to maximize every market cycle. This is disgusting. And so these very same people, many of them, they rightly decry the erosion of our democracy and are concerned about trust in our institutions. And it's like, look in the mirror. I mean, you're such a part of degrading anyone's faith that you all are acting in the public interest. So yeah, this exposes the corruption, it exposes the hypocrisy, you know, the people who are saying they care about climate change and then they're out there, you know, trading stock in ExxonMobil or whatever, the people who claim that they hate the tech giants, et cetera, and they're out there. Yeah, they're profiting off of whatever our tech oligarchs are out there doing. It's exactly what you would expect, and yet we cannot just accept it as business as usual. And to your point about the incentives here, look, whether you're a good person or bad person, people are not always aware of the way that their incentives are shaping their behavior. Oftentimes, they're sort of influenced by it. They rationalize whatever decision it is that they're making in their committee without even necessarily being aware that it's because they have a financial interest. They may swear to you up and down it's nothing to do with it. But just like we saw with the judges who were compromised, who had financial investments affiliated with the companies or the entities that they were then having to rule on and not disclosing and not recusing themselves, oh, guess what? More times than not, they were likely to rule in favor of their financial interests.
That's the whole point, which is that, look, on balance, it obviously is going to have some sort of impact. Is this the core root of the, stasis, corruption, or whatever in Washington? No. Does it contribute to it? Yeah. And this is one of the things where nobody wants to talk about it because it is so bipartisan. You have a Republican senator, you have a Democratic senator, you have the Speaker of the House whose husband is, pulling multi-million-dollar trades. You have some people on here who consider themselves hardcore MAGA Republicans. Lance Gooden, I'm looking at you, Mr. Drain the Swamp and all this stuff. Oh, interesting. Ended up here on the list. A lot of 12 late disclosures totaling $60,000 in Stock Act violations. Seems a little swampy to me. I mean, every single thing that I'm looking at here, yeah, they could claim that they have an excuse or, oh, I'm sure, I paid a fine or, oh, I disclosed it. In most cases, they didn't even respond. You know why? Because they know nobody's going to care.
Right.
Most people in their district, not going to hear about it. Most people in America, also not going to hear about it.
That was the other thing that really struck me is if it wasn't for Insider doing this deep dive.
We wouldn't even know.
We would have no idea. Like, who's keeping track?
I mean, this stuff is very complicated. People need to understand is that because it's not like it gets fed into a database. They have to compile each individual member's data, enter it into a database, then break down the data by state, representation, all that, then look for a late violation, and then ask if they went ahead and paid for it. It's like what I just described to you would take, 10, 15 people, like months of work. It's a lot of work.
Huge project.
The amount of data entry alone would be immense. And yeah, like we wouldn't even know about this. Now that we do, I mean, is it going to make a real difference? Probably not. I saw rare for me to defend AOC, but I saw her tweeting about like, no, I don't own any crypto because I don't think members of Congress should be able to buy like fungible assets while they serve in Congress. And it was like, she was getting ridiculed in DC to that idea. I was like, no, that's
really?
Actually a really good idea.
So obvious.
Yeah, I'm like, that's
actually principled.
I'm like, that's unironically a very, very good idea. But that tells you a lot. That it's just, as far as I know, the only member of Congress who's ever really spoken about it, at least in recent times, and it's not going anywhere. For them to change the law, they'd have to change it themselves. That's the issue.
That's another problem. That's another thing that should be changed. We should be the ones governing the rules that
they should
apply.
have some sort of different, there needs to be some sort of check on Congress itself because that's the real issue.
I think that is the real issue.